Usually I'll just start with, well, I'm Canadian, but depending on who's asking it, I know what they're actually asking me.
It's about how do I place you? How do you come to belong here?
As soon as people find out that I am a refugee, they automatically sum up a story in their head about who I am and what my story should sound like.
You know, that's really what it's about. Every new immigrant kid knows there are norms that are not written, not, but communicated, nevertheless, what it is to be Canadian.
Okay. Ooh, okay. Hello. My name is Maysam, and I'm a second-generation immigrant. Today, I'm here to talk about how growing up in a country different to my roots has affected my identity and journey to figure it out. First, what is a second-generation immigrant? Well, second-generation immigrants are people who were born to at least one immigrant parent. For example, were born outside of Canada, while they were born in the country. So for example, my parents immigrated here from Libya, but I was born in Toronto, and my siblings were also born here in Canada as well, making them second-generation immigrants. And my parents are considered first-generation immigrants. The purpose of this video is to take a deeper look at how living in a Western country like Canada creates a different bump in the road for kids who live in between two different worlds, especially second-generation kids of color and third-generation, and people whose families have been here for 4 to 5 generations now. Like any good presentation, I have organized this video into 5 different parts. I'll be talking about the books I've read that have inspired this video, talk about second-gen immigrants and identity, peer responses, my personal experiences and journey, and lastly, a quick conclusion. Number 1. Books. Book number 1, The Skin We're In. One of the many ways that this book stands out from the other 3 that I have is that it's written by a Canadian author specifically talking about injustices in Canada. And I think that was important to me for one of many ways. Specifically, it's material that in a way validates my experiences. And I know that kind of sounds silly, but I have material at arm's reach that reminds me that my struggles, my experiences, and my feelings are valid and that there is something wrong. This book focuses on the year 2017 via a month-by-month analysis that draws attention to the struggles and injustices faced by Black Canadians on a daily basis. And I'm an Arab Canadian, but it didn't make this book any less meaningful. And its contents still, in many ways, allow for connections. Ultimately, it's a powerful book that promotes powerful thinking and stronger consciousness, and it's a book that I definitely recommend. At the end of the day, it was Ibu Patel's Acts of Faith that sparked the idea of what this video would be about. Acts of Faith is a book that's part memoir, part treatise that examines Patel's journey for finding his identity while growing up in America as an Indian Muslim. I'd say that the sheer amount of relatability was almost profounding. By the end of the book, I had to reflect for a minute because of how close I could relate to Patel's early experiences and treatment in a Western country due to his religion. While reading, I would have to take a minute sometimes because I would zone out. I would identify some of my own insecurities and how certain events may have been the cause for their early conception and how they still affect me today or how they affected me in the past before I grew out of them. Admittedly, and fortunately, many of the problems dialed down as I got older, in contrast to the author. Still, some of the memories and feelings I had repressed would come back time to time, and I realized them for what they truly were. Furthermore, this book provides one of the most valuable ideologies I've tried to articulate, but wasn't able to until I read it. pluralism. It's called pluralism. More specifically, something called religious pluralism. It's so simple to have a word for it, and it somehow makes it feel more tangible. Coexistence. Ibu Patel powerfully asserts that it's in humanity's differences that comes its strengths and preservation, and wisely says that the only way to save ourselves is by saving each other. Utilizing a prevalent aspect embedded in many religions and spiritualities: service to others. Book number 3. It's not about the burqa. This is a book whose 17 chapters are essays created by 17 different Muslim women. It helped me understand a bit more about myself, my internal obstacles, and again helped me feel like I wasn't alone like the other 2 books. These essays, as the back description describes it better than I can, is that each is a passionate declaration calling time on oppression, lazy stereotyping, misogyny, and Islamophobia. One of the many common themes among many of the essays was this disconnection between culture and religion when some of these women talked about their experiences growing up in the West, like in countries like the UK or in the States. They expressed their frustrations regarding the struggles and obstacles in daily life or growing up during their own identity journeys. Another common issue included inaccuracies from the media on depictions of Islam and also Muslim women in general. From the media that's produced to insensitive interactions that these writers have experienced in their lives, writers offer solid resolutions and life advice over their years in a couple of pages. It goes to show how powerful writing is for both the author and the reader. I felt myself not only relating to their feelings, but deeply appreciating how they explain their judgments for me to learn about and use in my own journey toward an identity I've been hesitant on exploring for quite some time now. For book number 4, White Tears, Brown Scars. An incredibly insightful book that elegantly and effectively investigates the histories of race and gender and how those histories continue to affect present day. Ruby Hamad takes an intellectual dive into how there is this incredible power imbalance in modern feminism. It takes the reader inside the issues of race and feminism in Western countries with deep historical context and how they continue to perpetuate and take different insidious forms in which she refers to as white feminism, and how toxic and harmful it is when it takes place. And it can be done by anyone because it's so mainstream. Hamad also details where and how various caricatures regarding different POC women come from. Connected to this book in a way that I did with Maryam Khan's book, It's Not About the Burqa, in regards to white feminism that's specifically enacted toward or against Muslim women. I thought about the different ways media, when I was younger and impressionable, tricked me into thinking wrongly about my religion and even heritage. It's also like a kind of informational guide to keeping feminism intersectional. Now let's talk a little bit more on the general things about second-generation immigrants, especially in relation to cultural identity and such, from my research. 1. You see, second-generation immigrants are different from their parents, who are considered first-generation. When growing up in Canada to first-generation immigrants, their kids typically have 2 or more sets of values coming from various sources. Their family, the cultural values passed down to them, values and points of views prevalent in their community, Canadian society, and the media they consume, typically of that country that they reside in. It's all up to them to decide how close to their hearts some of these sources will be in contrast to others. and how they affect that person's character. I recognize that I'm in a rather privileged position with having a home and a sense of security here, more so than what others can say. I see that there are opportunities available to me in which my parents worked very hard for to be that way. But it doesn't mean that this country and the community I live in doesn't have its flaws. This country can get pretty rough, but a lot of it gets overlooked. With parents who have a more stronger connection to their home country, they typically try to preserve it in the home, like with their kids. With parents who have a more stronger connection to their home country, they typically try to preserve it in the home, like with their kids. Canada is a country that is almost portraying a kind of boastfulness about its diversity and multiculturalism and acceptance. So you would think that these kids would grow up with minimal problems in regards to having a positive connection to their roots and integrating it into their lives living in Canada, right? Well, it's not that simple. One way to illustrate what I mean is, for example, Deanna Chang is a Vancouver-based journalist with the New Canadian Media. When her colleague Marcus Medford spoke to her for an article he was writing called The Immigration Identity Crisis, she explains that although Chinese culture and traditions were preserved by her mother and grandparents, she felt a disconnect between her family and her parents' experiences growing up in China. That is something next-gen immigrants can struggle with when forming their identity regarding their culture and mannerisms and values. Arti Patel, a lifestyle editor at Global News, also explains that some second-generation immigrants may reject and even resent their parents' culture and embrace Canadianness. This phenomenon is usually cemented in hopes of gaining acceptance or feeling like they are gaining acceptance. Now that doesn't sound like that should occur in a supposedly very accepting and diverse country, right? Quick expose. Technically, Canada is a multicultural country by definition. According to the 2016 Census of Population, immigrants made up 21.9% of Canada's population, with second-generation immigrants making up 17.7%, and visible minorities making up 22.3%. And you can only imagine that these numbers have only grown since then. However, there's still reports from second-gen POC experiencing racial, cultural, and/or religious discrimination. Not in small numbers either. You know, I hear it all the time, comparing Canada as being better than the States, to a point where it seems like it's a staple of Canadian humor. But it's also a tactic that digresses the racial problems in history that exist in this country too, and overlooking problems that exist in POC communities. So rather it being a smooth walk in the park, second-generation immigrants can experience a disconnect or even resentment with their roots, depending on their experiences in their communities, and not to mention the narratives we see in the media all the time, subliminal and overtly. I'm also talking about how mainstream media produces, portrays, and reproduces stereotypes of cultural groups of a country, and like a certain type of viewpoint toward that culture or toward that country, toward that people. We either consume that, or it's redistributed by insensitive kids/peers during an important event in our lives for development and finding ourselves. School. I and other friends of mine who for the most part are also descendants of first-generation immigrants have talked about how they've experienced different forms of discrimination, from microaggressions to overt rudeness. Luckily, it isn't always turmoil and dissent. Others find a balance between their two different worlds. To look at the parts that individual feels best suits them and their character, to embody and preserve the greatest parts of both worlds. I think that's pretty powerful and really only achievable if you don't let the dissent and harmful media portrayals get to you from both sides. This is where I want to talk about the survey I created for peers and for anyone that wants to talk and answer questions regarding about how growing up in a different country to their roots has affected their identity and their cultural connections. Okay, so the first two questions were like asking if anyone wanted to like share their name or be anonymous, but at the end of it, I just like totally omitted that because most people want to be anonymous, and so I decided, yeah, that would probably be the best thing to do. But the form did happen. Here's proof. In total, I got 11 responses, and I've made a total of their responses. You know, like a condensed form, a like conclusion, if you will, that I'm about to read out. First question: were you born in Canada? If not, where and how long ago was it since you lived there? 73% of responders replied as second gen, while 27% replied as first gen. So we have an 8-to-3 ratio. Of those who mentioned their backgrounds, there were 2 Koreans, 1 Libyan, literally not me, 1 Vietnamese, 1 Filipino, 1 Métis, 1 Russian, and 1 Ukrainian/Irish. 4 others remained undisclosed. Next question was, do you feel like there is a disconnect between you and your family's cultural roots, heritage, and/or religion? 73% of responders said they felt a disconnection/detachment from a range of things: religion, cultural/ethnic roots, along with traditions, practices, and history, and language. A commonality with responses shows a level of desire to connect and keep in touch, but different barriers seem to prevent responders from doing such. As an example from respondent number 9, they go on to say, "It has definitely impacted my culture and education on traditional South Korean practices. Although my family still carries them out, I don't feel that attached to it. Even for education, I feel that I don't have deep understandings of Korean history, which I wish I had." 27% responded with no, with one of the responders expanding to say, "Not a disconnection, more of a divergence to my own identity that encompasses both," which relates to what was mentioned earlier. For the third question, I asked, do you feel that there are others in your family who have a better/stronger connection to your roots and heritage? Of 10 that responded, 80% said yes, while 20 said no. Some reply with only yes. Others include that their parents have better, more closer cultural or religious ties. For question number 5, I wrote, do you feel like growing up in a country like Canada has affected your connection to your family's culture and how you define yours? Why or why not? Of, again, 10 that responded, 90% said yes, while 10% said no. There was a lot to unpack when reading the responses, and to essentially summarize the 90% yes percentile, I've written, second-generation immigrants will have different experiences growing up in a westernized country, and typically develop a set of values and perspectives more unique to relatives and parents with connections to their cultural and religious roots. The West can be a space for exploration and self-understanding to create a unique identity, but without cultural barriers or accommodations, it's hard to preserve things like language, food, and music, and other sectors that one may like to have a better connection to. And sometimes having a Canadian experience involves less cultural and religious integration and can feel more like having to leave that at the door sometimes. For the next question, I wrote, do you have any negative experiences in Canada in regards to any aspect of your identity? Now, only 7 responded, with 5 saying yes and 2 saying no. The 5 that said yes, they provided a lot of information that has allowed me to create a couple of points, as follows. Point 1. Racism. both overtly and covertly. Number 2, the issue of being too ethnic or not ethnic enough. And then, from that binary, feeling pressured to choose one, instead of feeling comfortable in finding a middle ground or embracing yourself without having to be defined by ethnic level or ethnic proportions. Point number 3, being mocked for the food that they brought into school. The 4th and final point that I saw was an understanding that there are people in the West who will view immigrants, no matter generation, as outsiders, no matter how much they assimilate. This reminds me of a point that was included back in Marcus Medford's article, The Immigration Identity Crisis, where people who are descendants of 4th generation or 5th generation immigrants, typically from like World War II, who immigrated here during that time period, would still have trouble with questions regarding where they're from, which relates to this answer. Because, yeah, there's always gonna be people who put so much emphasis on origins and such, which can get very troubling and annoying. Question 6. What do you think about Canada being considered as a country with equal opportunity that promotes multiculturalism and encourages integration? Agree or disagree? Why or why not? Here are 4 points. There's going to be inherent bias among many Westerners that creates turmoil in immigrants between cultural balance and assimilation. There are still many ways that multiculturalism flourishes in this country. It's bound to happen when so many diverse groups exist in the same areas. It's the work that's done by others that makes it so brilliant. Canada isn't perfect. It does have its issues, but it also has opportunities that can be used to promote healthy, pluralistic messages to Westerners, immigrants, and immigrant youth. Canada should take more initiative, however, regarding the Indigenous population of this land, relations and actions to reconcile with the nation's past rather than be performative or dismissive. And for the last question, do you have anything else you would like to share? Feel free to put as much as you'd like. This response is in case these questions did not cover things you wanted to say. The one and only point here is people will compare Canada as better than the US, and it feels like they are glossing over how problematic this country really is. This reminds me of an excerpt from Desmond Cole's book, The Skin We're In, on page 37, which follows. This definition is particularly relevant in Canada, a country that favorably measures itself against the brash American brand of racism. These responses were really widespread, and it was very interesting to hear from various voices, and it was also really sad. This is why listening to others is so important. It helps to distance ourselves from ignorance and to equip ourselves with the mindset, with the critical thinking skills, and the empathy to build towards a better future. My parents immigrated to Canada in 2003 and had me later in the same year. Up until grade 4, we moved a lot. I remember moving after every summer, so I've been to a couple of elementary schools, and in between moving and school, we would also visit family in Libya. Now, those visits to Libya are like distant memories, those early visits, but you can tell that my parents did try to build a connection between me and my cultural heritage, especially with family. However, it was difficult with the moving and with the periods where we couldn't go to Libya for a bit. Not to mention, every time I went, there was always a language barrier. Even now, I know my Arabic isn't all that good, And it's probably gotten even worse now. I still face barriers between me and attempts to connect with my family, to culture, to language, and religion. For example, the pandemic. Because of the pandemic, we couldn't go to Libya last year, so it's been a couple of years since I've visited extended family or talked to them in person. When it comes to my family's language, it feels like I'm falling off the deep end. I've been meaning to take time to study to improve my Arabic, but the only excuse that I have is that I'm busy. Difficulty with language isn't the only fickle I've had to deal with growing up in Canada. While there is a solution to claim my language again by taking the time to relearn it, there isn't a exact solution to scrub away the experiences of discrimination and those feelings of other I've had in my life. It's such a bad pun, but I gotta make it. Now, of course, I've only written what I feel comfortable writing about, and then in turn talk about the effects and discussion on the experience. I believe my earliest memory of religious discrimination was when I was on the bus to my new elementary school in grade 4, and I was sat alone, minding my own business, when an older white boy started talking to me from a seat diagonally across from the one I sat alone at. I can't remember what we spoke about or how the topic even came to it, when he somehow got me to say, like, I believe it was a conversation about where I was from. And then I think I told him that I was a Muslim, and his demeanor changed. You can see it just in their eyes and their expression, and you just know. That's when I learned that that's when you know that something is not gonna go well. This was before I even knew what 9/11 was, and I was so confused, and I just remember crying, and I just didn't have a good day that day, and that was my first day in the new town, a new district. I believe because of this one experience, I became very defensive about my religion in school. I felt very other sometimes, and I couldn't explain it until now. Furthermore, I believe this prompted more teasing throughout the 2 years I was at that elementary school. Although I was defensive at school, I also became very withdrawn at home. Religion became an obstacle to me rather than an average thing like it used to. Faith lost its value before I could even be conscious to see it, and it really stagnated any sort of development with self-acceptance for longer than I want to admit. Additionally, the manufactured reputation painted onto Arabs for being threatening and aggressive created an anxiety for me and pressure to always be in line and essentially conform when the situation called for it. Experience number 2. After grade 5, I went to school abroad in Libya for grade 6. I would stay with my extended family, specifically at my grandparents' house. My parents and my brother, after the summer, went back to Canada, and I studied there because my parents thought it would be a good idea to help me improve my Arabic and connect with the family that before this I didn't see often. However, I definitely didn't attain my full potential with either prospect while there, and I believe that this was because of elementary school and my Eurocentric conception of not only my country, but also my religion, and as a byproduct, my family. Like, I didn't create my own conclusions. They were already made up for me and unfair. Although studying in Libya for 1 year had its ups and downs, I can say by the end of my study, I at least did strengthen my ties with my family, and I did improve on my Arabic. Again, though, not to its greatest potential as I would have wanted to, looking back now, because again, I did show quite a lot of resistance in the beginning. You see, it was strange living in another culture when you're more used to the one back home, especially at like such a young age. We didn't have good enough internet to watch YouTube, which made me feel sad, but additionally, I think I felt cut off in a way. I don't think I used social media either, so I felt blind to what was happening back home. I also struggled to fit in Libya because I was too westernized. That's another thing that second-generation immigrants experience, going back to the country of their roots, and they have trouble fitting in because they're considered too westernized, with too much of a Western mindset or whatnot, which is really discouraging and very unfortunate. Also, I recognize that in some ways I was too obstinate. In my mind, there was no way this developing country could be any better than Canada. The best country in the world. It didn't dawn on me for a while that family and claiming my language was more important than that. That countries may have their flaws, but you can find brilliant unity and connections within the communities that are there. Not to mention, I feel that calling them developing countries, instead of calling them developing countries, I understand it's more like recovering countries. Because they're recovering from centuries of European imperialism and colonization. The effects are lasting, and there's still negative interventions and exploitation all around the continent and other countries too that prevent them from flourishing in the ways that they could have without any meddling. I have come to my own conclusions about my country and its culture. For my third and final point I wish to share, another experience that I've had growing up in Canada is with my relations with white feminism and how it has betrayed me. Now, to define white feminism, I'm gonna use Maryam Khan's description because this one would be a little too long. I'd have to cite the whole book. Maryam Khan writes that white feminism, which is still the mainstream, centers the agenda and needs a white, straight, middle-class, cis, able-bodied woman while making claims that it speaks on behalf of all women. A white feminist is someone who furthers that ideology no matter who they are. And look, I've heard feminism say a lot of things, and a lot of Eurocentric things, one of which is its narrative on the hijab, especially when I was younger. And they paint it as a tool for oppression rather than for what it is. A piece of fabric that's just a method to show faith. And again, we're not forced to wear it. I've never been forced to wear it, neither has my mom. It's just something that we choose. And you're not supposed to ever force it. It all comes from free will. That's what it's supposed to be. It's a choice. So it's ridiculous to hear these narratives about attaining freedom from subjugation by removing a scarf. Again, if someone's being forced to wear the hijab, that is cultural interpretation reinforcing the patriarchy. That this is not what our religion says to do, ever. And can we also recognize that other religions have like the same concept with wearing an article or an accessory as a representation of faith? To end this off, I really want to say a big pet peeve of mine is that I hate, and I mean hate, praise for not wearing it. I hate praise when it's personal. I hate praise when it's like outside in like some sort of like article I'm reading. I need the politicization and demonization of it to stop. Muslim women don't need to be policed. Our bodies don't need to be policed. They need to be part of the conversation in areas in which they are oppressed. In all communities, in all nations, and including how we're represented in the media. That's my take. This project was definitely like a chance to unpack, process, and exercise the work I've done for myself in regards to understanding myself and evolving my thinking and consciousness and overall resolutions. I feel more comfortable than before after putting in the work to understand and unlearn many toxic perceptions and habits that I used to have and sometimes didn't even realize were there until I started reading more and confronting them as I did. Choosing books from a diverse range of authors on various subjects and topics has been one of the best decisions I've made so far. It gives you a wide range of perspectives and a great amount of knowledge that deepens your character and can drastically change how and what you think about the world around you. Identity is a difficult thing to get a hold on, as well as confronting your internal struggles and conflicts that might be in the way of finding your true self. My journey is far from over, but I am proud for where I'm at right now and all the work I've done so far. I'm still cultivating it, and so are many other members of my generation. Some of us feel that wave of disconnection and separation and confusion from many external factors in our environment. But I'm rooting for each and every one of us to resist, to plant their feet down and follow their intuition and intellect and create an authentic understanding and appreciation for their individuality.